Season's greetings and welcome to a very festive edition of Sandbox. In Echoes and Flow, the science of memorable venues, we're looking at all those public venues that delight and inspire. We'll be looking at everything from art galleries and libraries to science museums and theatres where highbrow plays are staged, as well as that fine, festive British institution enjoyed since the 17th century, the pantomime. These buildings are often historic architectural classics that are decades or even centuries old, and with the holidays coming up, no doubt many of you will be visiting at least one special exhibition or show. But don't be fooled, for beyond those buttresses and behind those proscenium arches, cutting-edge science, technology and even psychology are being applied to keep these places viable in the modern age while still keeping them memorable and magic. As always on Sandbox, I have a splendid panel of experts to offer their insight, and as they introduce themselves, I'm going to ask them for their favourite venue, purely from the point of view of a visitor. As somebody who's always harboured foolish dreams of pop stardom, I love the Royal Albert Hall. It's beautiful and ostentatious, and its dimensions should surely negate its effectiveness as a music venue, but it has an ingenious system of seemingly random but precisely placed mushroom structures arranged on the ceiling, and somehow that solved the acoustics problem. To me, that in itself is a kind of magic, as I often find myself staring at those strange ceiling fungi instead of watching the band on the stage. With me this episode, talking about how science makes venues memorable, are Bura Happold's very own Christine Lowry and Dr. Becky Haywood. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Christine, and your favourite venue as a visitor.
Thanks, Andy. So, yes, I'm Christine Lowry. I'm a partner at Bura Happold. And you probably need to know I'm an engineer and a sustainability consultant, because that's probably relevant for lots of the answers I'm going to give to future questions.
Very relevant.
So I've worked on lots of building projects, cultural venues in particular, museums, events, theatres, and I'm happiest when this is combined with the refurbishment of historic buildings. So my favourite venue, I think I've got a sort of a collection of venues, and they all have something in common. And that's that when you go to experience something, whether it's the theatre, it's an event, it's a museum, you're looking at things, you actually are enjoying the thing you've gone for as well as the building itself. When we get to mix those two things together, so you get a little bit of delight from the space you're in as well as from what is there to entertain you. So particularly a project that stands out for me was the redevelopment of Liverpool Central Library. And if you've never been, you have no idea what's in there from looking at the front of the building. It's definitely a surprise when you walk in the door.
Thank you very much. That's lovely and very intriguing. And the same request to you, please, Becky.
This is Becky Haywood, Associate Director in our Analytics and Crowd Dynamics team at Bura Happold. I'm actually not an engineer by background. I'm a biologist. I studied animal behaviour for my PhD, so looking at ant colonies and how they interact and pass information to one another. So it doesn't take a wild leap of imagination to go from ants to crowds. My experience at Bura Happold, I work on a wide range of projects at building and city scale, looking at how people use spaces and what they like and dislike about them and how we can help improve the overall experience. My favourite venue, I would say, I've really enjoyed the Picasso Museum at Malaga for a number of reasons. One is that actually it's the place that he was born, so you can really get that sense of connection and history and pride at the museum. One example is his father was a pigeon fancier, and there's a great collection of some of his early sketches of pigeons and doves, which I just really loved. The other thing is the building itself. There's a lovely central courtyard, which, you know, when you've overdosed on lots of Picasso paintings, you can take a moment of respite there, overcome your museum fatigue. So overall, just a really nice museum that I'd highly recommend.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And offering us a unique performer's eye view this month, we're delighted to welcome comedian, actor and voiceover artist supreme Alistair Barrie. He's performed all over the world in venues both memorable and some, I imagine, he'd rather forget. Though Edinburgh will be a memorable one because he's twice been nominated for Best Show at the festival. He's also appeared on our TV screens and on radio panel shows and is a regular at Glastonbury. Welcome, Alistair. Tell us a little bit about you and your favourite venue to visit.
Well, you've given me such a shiny CV. I don't think I need to tell you any more about me. I had no idea I was a voiceover artiste supreme, but I hope I sound okay on here. I think you're absolutely right. I've played astonishing places, from the Lyceum Theatre in the West End to a venue on Saturday night that I don't ever really want to go back to. So there is a real mix, and so much of it is about the people and the experience. But I totally agree with what Christine said. It's that lovely thing of going to a venue, not so much for a stand-up, that's a very odd thing as a stand-up. You can go from a theatre to a tiny fringe venue. But it's that thing of the environment adding to the experience. And I mean, trying to work out I've just literally sat down and written about 4 new notes while the guys were talking, because I went to the Titanic Museum in Belfast the other day, which is just magnificent. And then, weirdly, 2 weeks later, I was at the Titanic exhibition in Calais, which is also really good, although not as good as Belfast. In terms of design, it's a little bit, well, funnily enough, chiming with you, Andy, the Natural History Museum, because they have the same architect as the Albert Hall, Alfred Waterhouse. Didn't Google that at all. And it's kind of everyone's favourite building, the Natural History Museum. I've gone there as a visitor. I've performed in there a couple of times as well. It's not a great performance space. It's the Natural History Museum. So it's just beautiful. And those, the stones and all that. And I am a sucker for the old, wherever you go, the classic, statues of people and names underneath and plaques. And then on the outside of the Natural History Museum, you've got every single animal. And I could go on for hours, but I believe I should stop.
No, I hope that you do go on for hours in a bit. That's why you're here. So it's brilliant. First of all, I want to ask each of you to tell me what makes a venue memorable and what are the criteria for a positive visitor experience. I'll go to Christine first.
Great question. From my point of view, being a building services engineer, not noticing anything I've done to make the building work definitely adds to the positive experience of people. Making sure they're the right temperature, very important. So almost, I don't want them to notice what we've been up to. I don't want them to feel the ventilation systems, the heating, the cooling. They need to just not be experiencing all that hard work that's gone into making sure they are the right temperature, or that the sound, they can hear the sound right, or all those bits that actually make a building work. If we get that bit right in the design and the construction or refurbishment of a venue, you really find that user experience is second to none. But actually, they don't notice that all of that's gone on, which is sometimes a little bit disappointing.
You've got an interesting example, Christine, about Hyde Park Picture House and about talking to the people who actually use the space, because for them, temperature wasn't so much an issue, was it? Tell us what you were talking about before.
So the Hyde Park Picture House is a single screen listed historic cinema in Leeds, and we were commissioned to support the refurbishment of the building. It's about 100 years old, and the client was very, very worried that everyone was too hot within the space. So we needed to establish what the problems were. So we thought we'd survey the audience. So we gave them some questionnaires and we gathered feedback. And so this overarching issue of it's hot, it's stuffy, we need to deal with the air conditioning within the space. It was a naturally ventilated building, and most of the natural vents had been sealed up over time, so they weren't working properly. What we found is when we actually surveyed the audience, all of those surveys came back saying, it's too noisy. We can hear buses, we can hear planes, we can hear street noise, ambulances going past, and that's ruining our cinema experience. Nobody mentioned how hot or cold it was. So although that might actually have been an issue that the staff thought was a problem for the venue, the audience were finding the noise which was present every single time they had a cinema viewing, so it affected everybody all the time, was actually a much bigger issue for us to sort out with the refurbishment works.
Thank you, Christine. And Becky, you've been doing some fascinating work on the psychology of crowds and the way they flow. Can you just tell us, what is the optimal flow of a crowd through a place? How does the way we move through a space help our experience of it?
Like Christine said, when we've worked at a venue, you should not really be able to tell that we've been there and intervened in some way. So it should feel like a seamless experience moving through the entrance, through to the sort of orientation spaces and the exhibition content. I think part of that means queues at museums are inevitable. So we need to find ways to distract and entertain the crowd whilst they're waiting. The projects like the Urban Nature Garden at the Natural History Museum is a great example of that, bringing some of the content out into the queue space outside the museum so that people can engage with the content whilst they're waiting to go in. As well as that, I think it's the flexibility to cater to different diverse audience types now that are, coming and experiencing the museum. Some people really want to deep dive and read every single exhibition content. Other people want to skim through, quickly tick lots of things off their list and see as much as they can in the time available. And I think museums are becoming increasingly aware of this and offering like diverse exhibition content. One great example, we recently worked with the Book of Kells in Dublin. So there is the Book of Kells in the old library where you have, the book, and then you have the interactive exhibition adjoined to that, which has got much more sort of interactive spaces where you can play and interact with the different exhibition content and have a different experience, which I think has been really, really successful.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Becky. And Alistair, I'm fascinated to know, how do your experiences and needs contrast between being a performer and an audience member when you're in one of these memorable venues, a theatre, say?
Well, I think we've all been the audience a lot more than we've been the performer, and I just happen to be a performer for a living. But firstly, I think I should probably apologise to Christine for driving my helicopter and my fire engine past the Hyde Park Picture House. But I was actually doing it to protest the temperature inside. So in the end, everyone was happy. But I think it's a very odd thing. I think the flow that Becky was talking about is really interesting. And outside being a performer, I went to a hospital with my wife for an appointment the other day, the Royal Free, and you just went, oh, this is how a hospital should have been designed, because the flow was just brilliant. It was almost, and I say this advisedly, my wife and I both kind of went, I quite enjoyed that visit to a hospital. And funnily enough, I mentioned what Becky had been saying previously about flow, because it's fascinating. For a venue, obviously, we're all ludicrous, egocentric, maniac show-offs. So one of my favourite venues is the Empire in Belfast, because it's an old music hall and it's fantastic. I think there's various things, like if you go to like the Comedy Store, one of the great comedy clubs, it's a low ceiling. Everything's concentrated on the stage. That's such a great thing about, especially if you go back to ancient Greece and go to the amphitheatre, up to somewhere like the City Varieties in Leeds, everything's focused on the stage. And when you've done gigs in a cafe on the Alps, everywhere, trying to make it work, suddenly doing it in a theatre is a proper theatre. Like, again, I said the Lyceum's the biggest West End theatre I played. I think it's 1,600. And every movement is exaggerated. Its effect. Your 5-minute routine takes 10 because they're enjoying it more, because it's a really sort of almost, I hate to say sort of terribly pretentious, but sort of transcendental experience when you compare it to the venue I mentioned on Saturday. So it varies enormously, but as a performer, part of it is the joy of how well it goes, which is all to do with the people, but a lot of it is to do with what Christine said. People don't realise how much difference the space makes to what you're doing. And a very good friend of mine who got nominated for the Perrier years ago, when she did the West End run they do when they get nominated, she came up to me afterwards, she went, "You have no idea how hard our job is." Now, it's not hard, but in comparison to doing a little tiny drafty fringe venue to a proper theatre, the effect is incredible, but almost quite hard to describe.
Yeah, amazing. It must be such a buzz. I think, obviously, there's lots of jobs that are more terrifying, but stand-up, I think it's, you get, Alistair, I really do.
No, you get ridiculous, because we're all mad, so we don't think it's, we all want to show off. We all need the dopamine.
Absolutely. Now, buildings such as libraries, art galleries, museums and theatres have, I imagine, very particular challenges to them, both in terms of sustainability and indeed in the way that we get people moving through that space. So I'd love to talk about some of those particular challenges now, because, they're older buildings, they're listed buildings. Christine, I'll go to you first. What are these challenges?
So there are many challenges. I will start with that. And I think for me, they present themselves. There's two significant ones. The first is making sure that people are comfortable, equivalent to modern standards. So you can create in a brand new building, you've got everything in your control. You can design the entire building and all the services systems to make people feel exactly the level of temperature or acoustic experience you want. Trying to replicate that quality in an existing building can be really challenging. We're constrained in terms of the space that you've got. Usually you want to see the beautiful building. So where you can actually run things to put up I love the Albert Hall mushrooms are a great example. They had to embrace the mushrooms. They're not invisible. But a lot of buildings that I work in have historic listed ceilings with beautiful plaster work and paintwork. And you want to be able to enjoy that at the same time as standing quietly to reflect on the book you're about to borrow from the library specialist reading room, for example. So that can be really challenging. The other great challenge is the sustainability of these buildings. And I often get asked the question, is it really sustainable to refurbish these buildings? And I think we now understand that the carbon that we've burnt to create them in the first place counts for an awful lot. Yeah. So if we can then improve them a bit, such that their operational running intensity is far lower, by insulating, by controlling them better, by making sure they respond to the needs of people rather than being everything all on all the time. If we can make those savings, we can really start to drive into making these venues as sustainable as possible going into the future.
And Christine, I do want to go to you again because we've talked about this before, the drama behind the theatre, if you will, because there's a different kind of pressure, isn't there? A time pressure with these sort of projects. Because I was reading about how when Vera Happold was working at the Victoria Palace Theatre, I believe it was, at Hamilton, there was an 88-hour turnaround. They had to, in between performances, they had to drill a borehole and they had 88 hours to do it, then get everything back on the stage ready for a performance. And that's quite a frisson of jeopardy there. And I think you've got another example that you were telling us about.
Yes, I mean, this happens all the time. I mean, and theatres are a great example, but any venue which is open to the public, downtime needs to be minimised because that's a loss of income to the venue. They need to be open and operational as long as possible. So when you need to do a major piece of work, my example's air handling unit replacement. Now, an air handling unit, it's a big box with a fan in it. Air handling unit sounds fancy, but basically it's a big box with a fan in it. Quite a complicated box. But they need replacing. And the military precision that has to go into the organising the works and scheduling it. So the minute your performance has left stage, you can actually start your work. And then that programming to execute all the bits that need to happen, like you say, to get the job finished and then back open your venue up and running so the audience can come back in. It is quite a remarkable feat of programming and execution that goes into just maintaining these venues. So these are typical activities that have to happen to venues all the time just to keep them up and running and open to the public.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, these actors, they don't know. They come flouncing into their green room. They have no idea what's been going on the 88 hours previous.
Could I just apologise on behalf of my people?
Actually, Alistair, on this subject, obviously nobody would expect you to drill a borehole. Obviously, that's not fair. But from the performer's point of view, what do you think the challenges are with a memorable venue? And I'm thinking in particular here, you've mentioned the Natural History Museum, a beautiful place. What's the problem with it as a place to perform in?
Well, I bring my own bore to performing, but it's interesting in terms of what Christine was saying about temperature, for instance, like Natural History Museums, it's a big old room, not that warm, but temperature's a really interesting thing. There's a very well-known chain of comedy clubs who really, the guy who helps design their rooms is a former architect, and he sort of straddles, I don't think he's an engineer, but, he straddles both camps slightly. And when they built a venue in Cardiff, they had a brewery come down and they thought they'd had a really good meeting, and so they were going to get their beer, and then they heard nothing from them. And a few weeks later, they got in touch with the brewery and said, "Sir, I thought we had a really good meeting." And the brewery "Oh yeah," because they've been talking about changing the temperature during the show because there's an optimum temperature at which people drink more beer. And when this guy, who also happens to be called Alistair, said, "Oh," and they went, "Yeah, well, the thing is, it just seemed like you were really into the comedy." And it's like, yes, because it's a comedy club. In terms of performing, somewhere like the Natural History Museum is quite well known because it's got that level of magnificence. When you hear the things that Christine and Becky are saying, putting into performance spaces and trying to make sure everything is there so it's right, then it's not noticed, which is kind of the skill, but also slightly irritating when you put all that effort in. Natural History Museum is a magnificent venue.
You were talking about the importance of the audience being comfortable and how even things like having people sitting on stools, you're going to be losing a percentage of the laughter straight away because they've not got that sort of shoulder-to-shoulder thing.
Absolute classic example of what I just talked about, of people not understanding how it can make a difference. If you're on a high stool, you're not gravitationally comfortable. Your centre of gravity is a metre higher than it would be in a chair. And I say it advisedly in comedies, especially, where you want the audience to be slightly uncomfortable. Not literally, oh, ow, this isn't, but they have to be engaged. They're sort of sat for, if your shoulder is touching the shoulder of someone next to you and a laugh starts, it's what I said about, great venues where the laughter goes around the room because it's infectious. If you're playing to 15 people dotted around a 200-seater venue, I mean, obviously the laughs aren't going to be as big as when it's sold out, but the difference in the way a laugh can roll when it's a sort of holistic experience between the entire audience.
So, Becky, there's an awful lot. Alistair there is talking an awful lot about the psychology of an audience, I suppose, of the visitor's experience. And we're going to talk about this in more depth in a bit about the psychology. But when people are going into a venue and they're moving around and we want them to move around in that optimal way, what are the problems with venues like museums, like galleries? Because I imagine they're usually older buildings, possibly a little bit labyrinthine, multiple levels. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, spot on. With older buildings, we often have challenges with navigation and wayfinding, also bottlenecks and level changes, as you've just said. We can use that to our advantage sometimes. So for people who want a more exploratory experience, that can be great. For people who just want to seek out like the star attractions, so the Mona Lisa at the Louvre or the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum or Dippy the Dinosaur at Natural History Museum, you can use, those people are going there because they already know they want to see that star attraction. So you can use that to draw them through different parts of the museum potentially and increase footfall to other spaces that they may not have planned to visit. It can work to our advantage in some cases.
Fantastic. And that makes us segue seamlessly onto my next question, which is, how do we meet these challenges? We want to keep the character of these buildings memorable and magical, but they can be challenging. And in these days of high energy prices and a climate emergency, they often need to be modernised, and efficiency and sustainability are financial and moral imperatives. And all the while, we're still wanting to improve these visitor experiences. Now, Becky, I want to go to you first on this one because you engage, your currency is analytics. And what is analytics and how can it help?
So what we try to do is look at how people move through a new space, align that with other measures. So it's not just the footfall. It's like, how do we measure their visitor experience? So we might look at what they're saying on TripAdvisor or social media, what are the most common themes that come up that people are mentioning online, and use that to try and inform, where we might need to see improvements. The other metric would be how much revenue is being generated as a, bottom line. So often one of the challenges we see in old sort of theatres and concert halls is, to be blunt, not enough toilets. So I'm sure lots of the ladies listening will be familiar with queuing up at the interval for a long time and maybe missing your spot in the bar. So a lot of my time is spent trying to convince clients and architects that we need to put more toilets in, not fewer, so that people can spend more time spending their money at the bar.
And also, psychology is something that you're bringing into the thinking around these buildings as well. Tell me about how you apply psychology, a psychological approach to the visitor experience and making these places memorable.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it works at a number of different levels, really. I saw a really interesting study recently about the painting The Girl with the Pearl Earring and how it actually traps visitors in this sustained attention loop. So when you first meet someone, your attention is typically drawn to their eyes and then their mouth. And what that painting does is it's like a triangle. You look at her eyes and then her mouth and then her earring, and then it draws you back up to her eyes. So you're sort of caught in this attention loop, which I just thought was really neat. And it explains why people find that painting so attractive and engaging. But that's really at a very, micro level at one particular artwork. But I think, you zoom out and your psychology is influencing how you move through the space at all levels. So, whether or not you decide to go to the museum or the theatre in the first place might be influenced by your own motivations or what you've read online and so on, or what the content is there. And then when you arrive there, there's many different factors that influence your experience and your decision making as you go around. One of the big things, obviously, that we look at is, how crowded it is. And that may deter a certain number of people. If the queue is miles long, extending out of the venue for the museum, you may change your mind and go elsewhere. And then if you encounter crowds in one gallery, the dinosaurs gallery at the Natural History Museum is always really crowded. You may think twice about going in there unless you've got small kids with you. Then there's other factors like the noise levels, the light levels, even the smells and so on can draw people in different ways. And I think that's really exciting. And I think it's a world that we're just starting to explore more and use as we look at the design and operation of spaces.
That's fascinating. And our previous episode of Sandbox was all about digital twins and that sort of thing. Do you use any of that kind of digital twinning with your approach to this, to the crowd control?
In the people flow of museums, what we do is create agent-based simulations. So each visitor in the model is a little dot or a 3D person, and we simulate how they would move through the museum. So we can set up different profiles. You might have your family group or your, art enthusiasts and so on, and give them different parameters and also like walking speeds or group sizes and different decision-making biases. And we feed them through the model and look at how the design impacts their experience and use that in an iterative process to inform the design and operations of those spaces.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Christine, with your sustainability hat on, I trust you get a sustainability hat with your line of work. If you don't, you should demand one. These buildings are often, they're listed buildings. They can be, I'm guessing, they can be a bit drafty, but they also often have very particular conditions that exhibits need and this sort of thing. So how on earth do you go about making these places sustainable and efficient?
So, yes, I'm always wearing my sustainability hat. At the moment, it's a red one with a fluffy white band around it and a little white pom-pom. But usually it's very green. And you're absolutely right. The conditions, the challenge of achieving certain conditions whilst being sustainable is really challenging because exhibits, materials, sometimes say paper. Let's take paper. Lots of exhibits in museums are paper. And I'm actually working with the British Library at the moment. They store a lot of paper in all of their books. Paper doesn't like to be too dry because it crumbles, and it doesn't like to be too wet because it goes moldy. Now, to achieve that in a sustainable way, there's a band of temperature that we'd like to keep the space at. Now, this is actually quite a cool temperature, which isn't actually comfortable for people. So if you've got a museum and you've got these exhibits, the people want to be a bit warmer. They don't want to always be in there with their coats. And I can tell you, if it's been raining outside, we don't want them in there with their coats either because they drip everywhere, and that's dreadful for exhibits. And in the case of the British Library, where they're a borrowing library, so they have to retrieve the books to be able to lend them out to the public, the person has to be in that space to retrieve them. So they don't want to be in a really cold environment. So in museums, we solve this quite often by actually containing the most precious exhibits in a specially conditioned case, which means we can condition a much smaller area within a building, which is much more environmentally friendly and sustainable. And in the case of the British Library, I'm working on a really innovative new project with them at the moment, which is a big collection storage facility where they hold most of their collections, which isn't at St Pancras. It's actually in the middle of the country, somewhere called Boston Spa. You'll never have heard of it, but just accept it's in the middle, right in the middle of the country, which made it easy for them to lend out to all the various parts of the UK. Now, there, what we've done is we're putting in automated retrieval systems, which takes the person out of the equation. And what this has allowed us to do is to hold the temperature much cooler, which means the big ventilation systems and heating, cooling, humidification, dehumidification systems that we would have once needed in this building, we don't need. So all that energy that would have driven those systems in the past, because we were trying to make the space suitable and comfortable for humans as well as the books, isn't needed. And their new facility is being designed to run completely passively. So none of these big systems are needed. Just the envelope of the building itself. This is what you can do if you're building from new. You can create exactly the environment that you want in a building by making that fabric that envelopes it really, really well constructed, completely airtight, really well insulated. And then those really intensive systems that you might once have had to have aren't needed anymore.
Brilliant. And Christine, this brings us rather nicely on to the Green Book, which is something that obviously Bura Happold's been very instrumental in helping to bring about. What is the Green Book? Could you tell us a little bit about that, please, and how that can help?
Yeah, so the Green Book, the Theatre Green Book, was first developed in conjunction with our own expertise, but also experts from the theatre world. And actually, the subject of sustainability is massively wide-reaching. And the Theatre Green Book was developed in 3 distinct sections. So it looks at how do you put on a sustainable production, accepting that there's a lot of energy and material waste in actually putting a production on, all those set changes, moving them around in the first place. It looks at sustainable operations. So how do you make sure your operation, dealing with all those people in, out, running a building, is efficient? And then it also looks at the sustainable buildings. How do you make the building itself more sustainable? And breaking it down into those three areas, we provided guidance that anyone can read, and you can really tangibly take away, well, this is what I can do for my venue. And the aim of the Theatre Green Book was really to put some knowledge in the hands of the people who can make a difference, who are actually running and operating these venues on a day-to-day basis.
I was speaking to somebody about it from Bureau Happold. They raised the very valid point that often the person who's in charge of sustaining the building, the building manager, is also the person who's selling the ice creams on show night. So you've got to couch this stuff in a way that people like me, for example, can understand. So it sounds like it's going to be a very important document going forward. Now, Alistair, in what way does it differ performing in a historic building to a nice shiny new one? What are the different experiences and challenges, would you say?
Oh, that's quite a good question in terms, again, you come back to sort of the magnificence of the venue can be an absolutely lovely thing. And as one I mentioned earlier was Leeds City Varieties, which is just, you've got that feeling of going, Chaplin stood on this stage. I mean, but then, I've done the Comedy Cellar in Greenwich Village, New York, which is a tremendously little, but it's a little basement comedy club. But then it was one of the top folk clubs in the 60s, and Dylan played there. So you're kind of going that, I'm as much of a nerd as the next man, and I'm like, this is what I'm playing here, and it makes absolutely no difference really. But it's a lovely thing. I think. Again, you come back to the point as a performer. Well, I went to see Blur play Wembley this summer just gone, and was it last summer? So everything blurs into one. But I saw Blur on when they first toured in a little club called Moles in Bath, which is such a great little indie venue. And then I saw them at Wembley. So there was that lovely, that's over 30 years of my life. And they're a great band, and they were great at Moles, and they were great at Wembley. I think there is a huge element to which you kind of appreciate. West End theatres are always joyful. If you find yourself again, back to the Natural History Museum, you're in a venue that people go, oh, where have you played? And you go, actually, I was at the Natural History Museum last week. Sounds more impressive than the Dog and Duck in Chiswick. But again, it does come back to, like what Becky said, are there enough toilets? Things like that, those things that make the performance space work. And that's why people like Christine have to come in and make them work, because sometimes historic doesn't necessarily equal practical.
Yes, I like it. Excellent stuff. And panel, what we're going to do now is we are going to don our silver suits and clamber into our time machines and whoosh forward 50 years and what is the future of these memorable buildings? Now, Becky, I'm going to go to you first, because you recently said in an interview that you feel like we're just at the tip of the iceberg of what can be achieved with analytics. And so where do we go from here?
Great question. I think we are moving towards more personalised experiences for visitors. So that might mean that you have an app on your phone where it's giving you recommendations as you go around, or tailored information as you go around, which could be all connected to the content, but also the retail and the F&B and so on. So I think maybe potentially there's a lot of opportunity for these more tailored experiences for people. Hopefully, though, just getting some of the basics right, like I've said, enough toilets, not having these pinch points, and wayfinding and navigation that actually works for people, so you don't end up lost in this labyrinth of a museum.
Lovely stuff. And if we get the toilets right, then these buildings, they're going to be flushed with success.
Oh, no.
So I'm really sorry.
You've just dug your own borehole, Andy.
Yeah. So let's move swiftly on. Let's pretend I never said that. Christine, how will we make these places even more sustainable, and what are the impacts of the work Bureau Happold has already done on such places? Obviously, you've talked wonderfully about Boston Spa, but what's the future sustainability-wise?
So, yes, with my sustainability hat still firmly on.
Nice. Suits you.
I think, for me, it's all about making the best use of the buildings that we've got. So we cannot endlessly build new venues after new venues after new venues. It's extremely resource intensive to do that. So we need to find solutions to some of these historic buildings. But I will say some of these historic buildings aren't actually so historic. A 1970s building isn't that old, but it still holds huge value in terms of the space that it's providing. And for me, making sure when we are resetting a building for the future, when we get the opportunity to refurbish it, we're making sure it can continue to be adapted into the future again is really important. So these buildings can have the longest possible life that we can give them. And we can think what we want it to be used for now, but in 10 years' time, culture will change, fashion will change, trends will change, what we can access at home will change. So our buildings need to be designed and built and refurbished to allow that future adaptation as we go forwards in time. 50 years, who knows what we'll be wanting to go and see in terms of museum exhibits or performances.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. And Alistair, obviously you've had this wonderful, distinguished career. How much has performing in memorable venues changed since you started your stand-up career? And what do you think the experience will be like in the future for performers and audiences alike?
Well, I think memorable venues are always going to be memorable venues. I loved what Christine said about the Albert Hall and embracing the mushrooms. I thought that was a lovely touch.
Yeah.
I mean, I went there to see, because the acoustics used to be bad. I mean, I went to see one of my favourite bands there, and it was a bit of a sit-down experience when they were an indie band that I was like, come on, dance. Oh, you can't. It feels wrong. So I think, but, you know, and I know for a fact I've never played there, but friends who've played the Albert Hall as a stand-up venue say it's pretty tricky. You walk into a magnificent church and go, this is magnificent, and most comics will look up and go, that is a huge vaulted ceiling that I need to fill, and all the laughter's going to disappear up there. So there'll always be magnificent venues that will come with their own challenges. But as Becky said, just get the basics right for performing and you're there. My main worry for 50 years' time, my worry is actually much more to do with how people consume entertainment. And speaking as someone who's now in their 50s, I've been doing this 25 years, it's all TikTok and Instagram these days. We're now in a situation where people devour a lot of their entertainment literally on their phones, on their iPads. And this has led to a lot of problems. Things like, if you're sat at home watching a video, it doesn't matter if you have a cup of tea, whatever you do. Basically, that's fine. But I do think people's ability to be an audience is challenged. And that's why the venues that's what venues are going to have to really think about. And so what we need are great venues with, you know, thoughtful people like Becky and Christine behind them. I almost feel there's a case of we're having to retrain audiences. And there was a lot of talk after COVID that people didn't know how to behave anymore. I think they do. But sort of the etiquette, if I go to the cinema and someone's talking, I am that guy who will go, would you mind being quiet? And I just think, because it's, you know, theatre, cinema, it's magic. When it works, there's nothing like it. And there's nothing that just ruins it, but you know it's illusory. And there's nothing that ruins that illusion like someone eating crisps loudly while texting next to you. That is actually where so much is going to have to be worked on in the coming years, is actually how we separate the live experience from the online experience.
That is such a good point, such a fascinating one. Well, there we have it. The drama behind the theatres, the science behind the museums, the exciting new chapters for libraries, and the art of keeping crowds flowing in galleries. Who knew that such historic places had such modern and positively futuristic systems and thinking thrumming beneath the surface? Well, we do now, thanks to our fantastic panel. Bura Happold's very own Christine Lowry and Dr. Becky Hayward and professional mirth machine Alistair Barrie. Thank you all very much indeed. So, if you settle down to watch the pantomime in a theatre near you over the holidays, you can be safe in the knowledge that, with the right thinking, that building's best years are not behind you, but stretching into a glorious and thoroughly cultural, magical and memorable future. Tell us about your memorable venues and what makes them magical for you. Join the conversation by using the hashtag #BHSandbox on X, the artist formerly known as Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe to follow the show. You'll find Sandbox in all the usual sources of podcast goodness. And finally, thanks for listening. And whichever venues you find yourself in, we hope you have a thoroughly marvellous and memorable holiday. Goodbye.